RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOpsAF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
Hello and welcome to RevOpsAF, the podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Camela Thompson, and today I am joined by Erick Mahle. Erick, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Vice President of Revenue Operations and Digital Transformation at Lendz Financial. We are a mortgage lending solution and providing specifically non-QM loans, which is a bit of a niche market. We've been in an exciting trajectory of growth. We just managed to 3x our growth. We're a small 50-employee company, but we're managing to hit the target of keeping that 3x steady every year. My role coming in was to build a stable foundation for the organization to be able to scale and really try to cut down on all of those silos that get created inevitably in departments as early as possible to build not only the right processes, but the right tech stack to support all of that within the organization. My background comes from larger organizations, senior director CRM at a 5,000 employee public company, and reporting under RevOps at the time, and also over 10 years of consulting in the Salesforce ecosystem.
Awesome. When we first spoke, we were talking about RevOpsAF topics, and you hit on one that was a hot topic across our executive think tanks. At the RevOps Co-op, we met with a lot of people in executive leadership and posed questions about revenue operations because everybody defines it differently and what it should cover. What we found, though, is that the opinions on whether or not revenue operators should control and own systems varied not only by the company stage, which is kind of expected, but by the coast. And what we found is New York in particular had very strong opinions about why systems should not be owned by revenue operations. So I'd like to know, where do you stand on this?
Well, as my 10 plus years of consulting have taught me, it starts with it depends.
We have a t-shirt for that, and I'm going to put it in the show notes.
I think there's a time and a place. And I think that organizations just need to understand overall what you're gaining and what you're giving up by having that. So typically in my experience, as you alluded to, the size of the company plays a big factor. If you're a smaller organization, you don't have as many departments, so more people wear more hats. And that makes a lot of sense for the intersection between business systems and revenue operations and part of the go-to-market portion of the business process, the enablement, the analytics, all of these things that we do under RevOps have that additional pillar of business systems be tied in. So it makes a lot of sense. The one key thing organizations just need to be mindful of is that as you pile on more pillars and more responsibilities, you're diluting what RevOps is. So you just have to be careful because, again, for example, if compensation plans, there are companies where revenue operations are heavy into compensation plans. You may not have the ability to do that if you're taking on also business systems or sales enablement or whatever it is. There's so many initiatives that you do under RevOps. If you just keep diluting it out and wearing multiple hats, there's only so much that you're going to be able to do. And business systems tends to be a very heavy column of responsibility to take on because there are a lot of things that you'll inevitably start doing. The upside, though, that you can make the very big case for is that if your business systems are directly aligned with your processes, that's really where you have the opportunity to build something that is incredibly valuable to the end users. So I think those are some of the key pros and cons to consider of having business systems under the RevOps umbrella.
I'm trying to figure out where I want to go next. I have such strong feelings that they're battling with the logic train that I should be following. So maybe we talk about another big factor in all of this, which was brought up over and over, data governance. So as companies go towards becoming public, they have a ton of rules and regulations they have to start following. I think the main argument we heard from New York was, if IT is going to take the systems anyway, why are we spending time building expertise there instead of focusing on the analytics and metrics and all of the other things the business needs us to do?
I would imagine that a counter argument to that would be, how can you possibly make sure that you have the right analytics set up if you're not on the driver's seat of business systems that you extract them from? If you're just going to end up going to Excel and manipulating your data, and not to say people never cherry pick their own data when everything sits in an Excel spreadsheet, but ultimately making sure that you're building that right foundation before you hand it off. And I'm not saying that you have to do it all on your own. I think there are tremendous use cases where, if you know your intentions well, if you know what your vision is, what your processes are, you have a well-defined ICP. If you have all of that, work with a consulting firm. It doesn't take too much to properly oversee a consulting organization to get you up and running on that platform, and then you just maintain it as you go. I find it hard to see how that would not be a valid alternative for folks that are just like, I never want to touch this to begin with.
Yeah, and the data governance argument, I have been at publicly held companies that followed all the rules and RevOps still owned the systems. We also took on a lot of responsibility around data access, all the rules, and enforcing data governance, but it was done. I've also reported, so my background started in analytics, adopted the systems, and this is back when Salesforce was first around. I have reported both directly to go-to-market leaders and to IT. And I think the main struggle for me is that the mentality of the business leaders on the go-to-market team changed drastically when they're dealing with somebody who's internal to them, they know understands their processes and systems, versus someone they view as a ticket taker who should just do what they say because they don't know what they're going through day to day. Are there other pros and cons you see to both of these situations outside of just relationship-based?
I think it's funny that RevOps, by definition, is unifying departments. And yet there's so much animosity when we're facing one of those other departments that are now within the RevOps tech stack. The relationship between RevOps and business systems, or RevOps and IT, when there is that separation of ownership of the tech stack, is simply that you have to work to make sure there is a positive relationship. And you cannot fall into the trap of just becoming a ticketing system, saying, give me all of your needs in a ticketing system. So what does that mean? That means you have to have some form of executive relationship with the leaders to be able to drive a vision, drive a roadmap, and understand, here's what we're trying to accomplish. And equally, IT also needs to take a bit of a responsibility, understanding that there's not only business systems in an organization. There could be ERPs, there could be a lot of back-end systems, your own organizational databases. As changes are made and systems are integrated together, everyone has to have a seat at the table to make sure what's being proposed really connects well with each other. So that way you're not doing something on one side that completely undoes what folks are doing on the other. And having that relationship, whether it's an executive planning session on a quarterly basis, or having some basic structure to review what's on the roadmap and what you're implementing towards. So that way it just doesn't end up, a million Jira tickets just sitting there abandoned, and those heavy hitting tickets never get the attention they deserve because you can't get traction and buy-in to move the needle forward, even if you tried.
Yeah. And having sat on both sides of this, being in IT as a systems admin and then working with IT as a systems admin passing on requirements, something funny happens. It is really difficult to get all the context you need out of the person who's gathering requirements in a meaningful way. And it's really easy to fall into the trap of what's the most efficient thing for the system and what does the business need in terms of analytics, while ignoring usability and user experience.
I think there is a lot to be said with requirements gathering, and whether it's just wireframing things before just jumping right into it. And it's one of the reasons why I enjoy revenue operations so much, because I find that the culture within revenue operations is to make sure that we have a process, that this is aligned, that this makes sense, and that we're not just shooting ourselves in our foot, proactively just jumping into configuration and changes without making sure that it aligns with the bigger picture first. And I really like that about the revenue operations culture, of not taking things at face value. And I think that could add, again, building the structure and the relationships correctly. I think that does work out really well in the long run. Going back to the point of when should RevOps own the business systems? If you start off with that and you lay that groundwork at first of what's foundationally important for you, what is lining up with your ICP, what is lining up with your sales processes and everything, I think that just adds tremendous value to the eventual point of handoff to an IT team, whether because you're going public or the organization is just growing enough, whatever the case may be, right? So I understand that data governance is tough and nobody wants to go through a SOX audit, so immediately pawn it off into IT so that way it's not your problem anymore. But at the same time, there's more than just data governance alone, headaches alone when it comes to whether you should own the business systems on the business side.
Yeah, and I think is such a great point, because that does seem to be what's forgotten is, what are you losing? And a lot of it is efficiency and usability.
Exactly, because one of the things is that IT will never have the same ease to understand how a business process works. And when you're writing code, it's if and then statements. If this happens, that is the result, and all these things. Whereas a sales process can have exceptions, can have different variables, and just being on the seat of a salesperson for a day. And sometimes you don't understand, you don't see it because you're not watching the end users using the platform and realizing that this is very cumbersome, that I have to go save information here and then go upload something there and then come back over here. Whereas RevOps, especially sales enablement, being part of building the training materials, being invested into developing the sales process and all of these things, they just have such a better affinity to be able to, that IT will comparatively never have that advantage, to be able to say, here's what makes sense for us in a system. And even more so, I think that companies without RevOps, and I couldn't tell you the exact statistic because this is coming from my head and my personal experience, but I feel like companies that don't have RevOps get themselves in trouble, because more often than not, when they try to reinvent the wheel, and if I only had a penny for every time that everyone says, oh yeah, no, we're a unique business process, we have a unique business proposition. And I'm like, it isn't. A lot of the call to revenue operations is to just bring it back to basics. And if there is a fighting chance for business systems to work foundationally, not only keeping in mind the user experience and all of these things, it's having RevOps to say, let's not shoehorn our business systems into our process. Let's adapt our business process as necessary into the business system so we can get the most out of the platforms that we're leveraging. So we're not like bastardizing and neglecting 80% of the features that comes with these subscriptions that we're paying, just because we really wanted our CRM to look like an Excel spreadsheet, because that's what people feel comfortable with.
Ugh, woof. I mean, I'm having so many flashbacks. I think one of them was like, I was consulting with a company, opened up their CRM, and they weren't using opportunities. They created a custom object because they were so different. And I'm like, this could have all been done in the opportunity object. And you shot yourself in the foot, because every integration you have is going to depend. Why?
Exactly. It's tough. And, I remember my consulting days, and I'll never forget this story. I got involved in a lot of projects that were cleanup jobs. Some other consulting partner came in, put whatever they understood on the proposal together, put it in place. They didn't fully understand it. And I always came in to clean up. That was a large part of my experience in consulting. I remember one day I sat down with a salesperson. I was like, let me see you take a call. The guy takes a call, finds the lead. It was on the lead object, starts taking notes almost immediately on paper on his desk. And he has a little notebook, and everyone has a notebook that they're just taking notes on during the calls. And then after the call's done, they'll convert the lead, create the opportunity, add the products, and do all of these things, and yada, yada, yada. And the thing that scared me the most was that he got the sale on that call. And he wrote down all of the payment information on that notebook. And all of those notebooks were sitting on desks at night. A cleaning person could have just come and swipe all of those notebooks out of everybody's desk, and it would be the worst disaster story. And all of that is born from the fact that this was an IT team that was separated very far, just followed saying, this is what they needed, this is what we proposed, didn't look into business processes to make sure something was easy and straightforward, that folks did not have to resort to going outside of the system for things, and look at all the trouble that it caused. So whether it's through a partnership with IT or whether it's setting the foundation before IT takes over, like revenue operations can play such a critical role in making sure that the foundation of the tech stack for the business systems are in the right place for years to come within the organization.
So let's say we're working in a public company, we're in a revenue operations team, but we have systems centralized in IT. We've accepted this is our fate. How should businesses think about pairing these two organizations to optimize efficacy? Where should the request go to initially? Where should requirements gathering happen? How should these teams ideally pair together to make sure that the business process and usability are being taken into account?
I think it definitely takes some level of executive sponsorship to be involved with the general roadmap design. And it can't be a Salesforce administrator working with a RevOps analyst at the low end level. Those are break-fix tickets and relationships that you have. Ultimately, I think a lot of companies get in the rush, and I understand. I've been through those tight deadlines, like this needs to happen. We just got this idea, push everything aside, and we're going to lock you in a closet for the next 30 days because this is the only thing you're going to focus on for the rest of your life. And I get it. I think that both sides have to have some form of realization that we need to pull back the layers and say, does this make sense? Is this aligned with the roadmap that we invested in 3 months ago? Is this aligned with the processes we documented? And wireframe it a little bit, because in my experience, both on the client side and the consulting side, too many companies want to jump on the build, and see what happens later. The companies that have been most successful have taken that time to proof of concept something first, or wireframe, just something to make sure you had run it by a couple of stakeholders before signing off and saying, let's pull the trigger on this. Or see if they can break it down and incrementally do things instead of taking a massive undertaking project, depending on the ask that may be completely off the mark, again, because they started building right away and they didn't take anyone else into consideration. He can play a key role because in large organizations, these systems are integrated. You're integrated to different systems, like whether it's the data governance and the data dictionary, making sure that we're capturing information the same way, right? And if we have to change that, being aware of, okay, here's the level of effort and here's how much that's going to change. Do we want to do it within the time frame, or do you want to do it the way you want it to do it? And let's make a decision, because these are things that are going to be impacted. So I think they both play their key roles, but making sure that they're evaluating what they're proposing more than just saying this makes sense and we want it right now, and signing off would probably make the biggest difference for the success in between these departments.
Yeah, and I think it also takes realistically looking at what the CRM is and the intent behind the tool. It's sold all the time as a selling tool in an organization. It's not. It's really just a means to get the information we need as a business to make better decisions. Keeping that in mind and realizing how much work the sales team and other teams have to do minute to minute outside of just data entry, really critical when you're building anything. Like just having the reporting infrastructure in mind, what's reasonable to ask these people to do on a daily basis? You have to look at it in the aggregate. It's not just another pick list. It's a pick list in addition to 40 other things that are required on the same object, right?
Yeah. And again, a great example as to where the relationship can work well, and you guys can find common ground, is one of the crucial things about RevOps is analytics, diving into the data and finding the trends and finding all of these things. What better department on the business side to help make sure that we are building things properly, measure on, right? So again, we're talking a lot about the relationship between these two departments, but even beforehand, it makes sense for RevOps to take on the tech stack, along with the many hats that it'll inevitably take on, but to make sure that the company is in the right path instead of just pawning off to a relationship between a consultant or a marketing director and a consulting team to put what they have in mind together. A lesser consulting team will take what the sales VP says at face level, just deliver on that, and then just sign off and be like, all right, we've done exactly what they asked, and it's not our problem to validate that. And now you have all of those problems that will come and inevitably in the future, whether it results to something as severe as changing CRMs because the implementation didn't work. But the problem is that the next implementation may go just as bad because all you have now that you didn't have before is hindsight, but you may still go with new ideas and new things and mangle it again. It's a very costly proposition for an organization to try to go at it that way. That's the thing that surprises me about folks that make the argument that business systems shouldn't be under RevOps, especially even whether it's at a small level. One of the interesting definitions that I keep seeing on RevOps popping up beyond just unifying the departments and maximizing revenue is to consistently and predictably scale revenue. And if you're predictably and consistently trying to do something, you need the systems to be able to if you're going to architect that out, you're going to need something to track it in. It can't be that far-fetched of an idea that the business systems would play a role in the revenue operations process, and especially when the company's small enough that you might still be outsourcing your IT systems for whoever sets up the computers and all of these things. All of these things just make a lot more sense to be able to start initiating a revenue operations department early on in a company's life cycle.
And I have to wonder if some of the reluctance to take things on is a fear of needing to do it themselves. I think both of us are not arguing for a jack of all trades to try to take on marketing automation, the CRM, enablement. One human being can't do all of those things. You need to be properly staffed, and there is plenty of room for specialization in revenue operations.
Yep.
That's not at all, I think, what either one of us is saying. I probably shouldn't speak for you, but what are your thoughts there?
I agree. One of the interesting things I've seen is that we're still trying to fully define revenue operations. We're still ironing out the kinks. If you have pillars like compensation plans, sales enablement, market analysis, GTM, business systems, and you line up those, the distribution of time into each one of those categories, into each one of those pillars, changes dramatically across organizations, whether it's small or large. Like there are organizations, I have a colleague of mine, and in his organization, the VP of RevOps is just so heavy into the compensation. It's a full-time job just managing compensation. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, that's not all of RevOps, right? Equally, in different companies, RevOps means different things. It goes back to that concept. Like if business systems becomes a pillar on RevOps to some extent, when it's a small company and you're wearing many hats, you're just distributing the proportions to the needs of the company. Maybe the company needs more business systems from a RevOps person. Maybe it needs more enablement. So those are some of the key things you just have to be mindful of. It's not something that's inherently bad. It's just the reality that you have to be mindful and know what you're giving up. And at that time, like you were saying, support with consulting when necessary to make sure that you can fill a gap if you need it, whether it's implementing a CRM or integrating two systems together. That way you can still oversee it and make sure that it's following the right direction, the right North Star that you're trying to set through revenue operations until the company organically grows in size and starts putting key people in those responsibilities.
Yeah. For those of you yelling at the podcast or disagreeing or shaking your head or having all sorts of feelings, go to RevOpsAF because we're going to have a live debate on this topic. And it promises to be a spicy session because there's a lot to be said here, and we only covered part the conundrum for sure.
One of the panelists is very much on the other side of this coin, on the opinion. So yes, it will absolutely get very spicy when we make it to New Orleans.
Yeah, and I appreciate it when people can have these debates and still be friends.
Yes.
Erick, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can people find you to network?
Best way to find me is on LinkedIn. You look me up there. Usually fairly quick to go back if you have a question or anything like that. I also can be found at a couple of the RevOps Slack workspaces, whether it's the co-op or many of the other great ones out there. Because the big ones are the co-op and the Wizard of Ops. So those are the two big ones that I'm usually at. And then any other Salesforce ones like Ohana Slack, you'll be able to find me there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.